Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the SharePoint Intelligent Intranet. I'm your host, Mark Cashman, here with my co-host, Chris McNulty.
Hey, Mark. Great to be back.
Great to be back as well. Love being in the studio with you in a bright, early Redmond day. And certainly the summer is over, and we're starting to see some clouds in the sky. That's interesting. Clouds in the sky.
There was this interesting also thing that was falling from the sky this morning in my car. It seemed to be some sort of moisture.
Yeah, and then there was these little kids singing, rain, rain, go. Not in a creepy way, but, in an excited way. Like, all right, so Northwest are what people think of the Northwest with the rain. It's true, but it is also an anchor for what we're talking about today, which is the cloud.
And it's one of the things, this week, we're actually getting out of the studio and heading out to some Microsoft data centers and talking about how we operate.
Yeah, so we're trying to go left to right from the actual physical location, the data center itself, to getting the data center ready with hardware, to then actually loading up the service. So if you think about what actually powers SharePoint in Office 365, it is the physical data center. It is, of course, the servers and the massive architecture to support all of that. And then the product itself, which is now truly a service.
One thing I really love learning about is how data centers at that scale are constructed. A couple of years ago, Michael Lewis had a book I was reading about high-frequency trading, the commodities industry. And it begins with a great story about setting up new data cables between New York and Chicago, which previously had followed the easy way to build a line, where the roads are and the railroads and likely things. And they decided they could make data transmission even faster by laser sighting it and going straight through whatever was there. Trees, mountains, didn't matter. And by doing a laser straight line, they reduced the time span from 17 milliseconds to 13 milliseconds.
Ooh, so page loads like that.
Like that. And if you're interested in that, we'll definitely be putting that in the show notes.
Yeah. I think the life of SharePoint breathes in those 4 milliseconds. It's either, I love SharePoint, or, come on, SharePoint. 4 milliseconds.
4 milliseconds.
Awesome. Well, I think a lot of people are going to get a pretty good insight into those actual cables, because that's a little bit about what our first guest talks about. So we're going to get a chance to talk to Richard Harrison. He is a data center technical architect. So he really does work in the data center, and he helps create actually what our data centers look like. He's actually one of those folks that works in the lab. We call it Redmond Ridge. Then we're going to move in and talk to Som Coelho, and he actually works on getting enough servers based on projections and doing capacity planning for SharePoint the service. So he's got a number of peers across the different workloads. And so he readies the service, and then one of our core peers that we work with in engineering, we talk with, his name is Zach Rosenfield, and Zach is all about everything that makes SharePoint run as a service at scale across the globe in all data centers. So that high frequency you were just talking about, that is SharePoint zipping along those wires, left to right, up and down, all across the globe in those fractions of seconds. So we have a great show lineup. Hang on for your hats. They are definitely going to be coming off. This roller coaster is going to be going up and down through the depths of the data center, up into the cloud and back down again. So we wanted to start out with one very simple question. Have you ever wondered what the cloud sounds like?
I have, and I would think it sounds something like this.
Ooh, I like that. I always thought it sounded something like this. Bring me your data. Bring me all your data. Thank you. But let's actually listen to a couple of clips. These are actually real sounds coming from the Redmond Ridge, which is one of our labs. This is the sound of a data center.
As part of our talk with Richard, we took one of the offered tours at Microsoft's Redmond Ridge 1 data center lab, where we got to see firsthand the continuously redesigned infrastructure and servers. Azure, Office 365, Dynamics, the Microsoft Cloud. This is where it all begins.
So we are fortunate to actually be on site with Richard Harrison. He's an MTC data center technical architect, and he works in a place called Redmond Ridge, which is essentially a data center lab.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Glad to have an opportunity to talk about it. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm not a local to Redmond. I'm an import. I was brought here in 2001 by Microsoft as a contractor, specializing in, at that time, networks for Windows infrastructure. So we had a project called MSA, the Microsoft Systems Architecture, and there was some 40 subject matter experts who were all brought here. We created a whole bunch of documentation that was used to help customers use best practices for deploying large-scale Windows configurations. I just fell in love with the US, wanted to stay here. So I came out here with my family full-time 2002. And then through quite a convoluted route, ended up working with a number of different engineering groups before I finally joined the operations team at Microsoft, who were known as Global Foundation Services back then. They've now been renamed. It's MCIO, Microsoft Cloud Infrastructure and Operations. So I got to work with those guys, and man, did they teach me a lot. I thought I knew about IT until these guys showed me what cloud IT looks like, and I had a lot to learn.
You told us that you didn't probably really hit the learning curve until you started to work with the people who are actually working and building and designing the data centers. So that learning curve, from where you started to where you're at now, where do you feel like you are in that journey of becoming a data center expert?
Still learning. So originally, I was actually an electronics engineer. So I worked in the aerospace and defense industry for Honeywell in the UK. But through a convoluted route, ended up discovering IT. And so when I arrived at Microsoft, I had enterprise experience working at enterprise scale. And what I learned when I joined MCIO was there is a big difference between enterprise scale and what they now call hyperscale, right? So cloud level services. That was the revelation. And it continues to be. This is such an interesting area that affects everything from breaking ground all the way up to how you generate power, how you cool things, how you connect this stuff up globally to provide a backbone that's capable of managing these services at hyperscale. That was the revelation. And I still learn every day something new.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned hyperscale. And one thing I recall a couple years ago, we produced one of those high-speed time-lapse videos of the construction of the West 2, one of the buildings at West 2 data center. And it's absolutely massive, and it gives you the statistics like there's enough wire and fiber optic cable in this building to circle the globe 300 million times. Maybe not quite that much, but you get the sense of it. There's definitely scale there, which fascinates me when we have people who come through the Redmond campus who ask, where is Office 365? Where is Azure? Is it in this room or so forth? And it's interesting. So we're here, we are in Redmond, but we're not at a production facility.
Correct, yes. This is a test facility. It's basically a lab. It's where we test a lot of the hardware and the software before it goes into production. So it's operated by our MSIT department. Mm-hmm. It's not operated by our MCIO teams. They're the production guys. Those facilities are very difficult to gain access to, rightly so. So you need to have pre-approved business justification before you go anywhere near a production facility. We don't have that, so this is the closest that we've got. And it's a great little test bed because we can see different generations of things that we have tested over time before it goes into production. Once you go into production, you want to stabilize it. You don't want people playing with it. You don't want people anywhere near it. You operate it to meet the services that you're designing for, Azure, Office, Bing, Xbox, right? You don't want people wandering around going, oh, pretty blinking lights. So we keep people well away from a production environment.
So as impressive as this facility is, if we were to be in one of the production facilities, what do you think is the most impressive thing out there?
Scale is difficult to ignore. The facilities, even if they aren't the very biggest that we build, we have to modify our designs to fit a global footprint. So building a data center in somewhere like Singapore or Tokyo is very different than building a data center like in Eastern Washington. So you have templates, you have designs, and you modify them to meet the requirements of that location. So when you go to somewhere like Quincy, it's a massive infrastructure. The land is relatively cheap there, so we can go horizontally and pour lots of capacity into what's a very stable environment there. Eastern Washington doesn't get earthquakes. It's not on the ring of fire like Western Washington is. So we build data centers out there because it's more stable and it saves cost. If we're building a data center in Tokyo, they do get earthquakes. So the infrastructure has to be reinforced against earthquakes. So when you go to a facility like that, when you see that scale rolled out in front of you, it's difficult to ignore. The more detail that you dig into the facility itself, the more interesting it gets, because that's where you see, why have you put a reinforcement there? Why did you go vertically instead of horizontally? Why are you using that type of generator versus this one? And there's always a reason.
So one of the things I think is kind of fascinating about what you through your team offer is that you bring people in to the facility, the lab here, to show them. And I think sometimes you bring them to some of the production facilities.
Yeah, so we're uniquely, as part of our transparency, right, we want to help our customers understand. We're not hiding anything here, how we build and design data centers. So we have a program that's very carefully controlled, and if you talk to any of our sales team about this, they'll know they have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get a customer approved for one of these tours. And it's simply because we are responsible to our auditors for all of the security of these locations. Even though they call it the public cloud, there is nothing public about our cloud. It's very tightly controlled. So when you have major customers who are really going through a difficult time with their own digital transformation, it can help them understand the difference between what they thought a cloud was to actually how we operate it for them to meet some of the world's toughest certifications. We're the most certified cloud out there. So those certifications mean something when you get to see them. So we have a very tightly controlled process that allows a limited number of customers to access a pre-agreed area of a data center that mitigates any risk to them or to our infrastructure. And we've been doing this now for 5 years, just over 5 years.
It's interesting. You know, when you obviously bring customers through, there's a lot of things that we do, though, want to promote about our data centers. What are the things when you bring customers through, as you did today, what are the things that you want to make sure that they walk away with an understanding of?
Without a doubt, it's the security first. We have done, I think as an industry, we've done a disservice to what cloud is. That whole expectation of, don't worry, it's in the cloud, it's safe, you don't need to know about it. That has caused a lot of angst in customers who are on the hook for some kind of compliance in their region, right? They need to know where this stuff is. Now, from our perspective, our security teams don't want to tell everyone where all our data centers are. We don't disclose where they are publicly. But when we take them to one of these facilities where it makes sense under these controls and show them how we operate globally to international standards that are independently audited, that alleviates some of those concerns. They see that this is not a tin pot little operation. This is world-class infrastructure run at hyperscale efficiently. And when they see it, then they understand. As we add more and more data centers, a lot of customers look at a data center as a thing, a single entity. And then if they have the money, they'll have a backup, so a primary and a secondary data center. All of our data centers are active. So you add more capacity by adding a new data center, either in the campus or at a different campus in that region. And that's how we scale. That's very different than what a lot of customers expect.
And so you mean the data campus, not the Microsoft corporate campus?
Exactly.
Okay.
Data center campus, yeah.
You know, one thing I've had some customer questions about, obviously, we have a lot of experience with SharePoint, and I've been working with SharePoint from an engineering perspective for most of my last 20 years. And occasionally you get customers who come in and say, you know, I've been working with SQL and even Sybase for years, and I think I know why I'm seeing something. I really want to change the log truncation period of this or that or the other thing. And I have to explain to them that the way that we build SharePoint in the cloud is barely recognizable to the way it looks on premises. What do you find customers are most surprised by when they see even a facility like this?
So they typically expect us to be deploying servers like they do. And we don't. We work directly with our partners and we build customized designs to meet the requirements of our scale. So we've made that specification public through what's called OCS, the Open Cloud Server specification. And that's available through the Open Cloud project publicly. So you can download the specs of this hardware. And we do that because we work with lots of partners who build these specialized servers for us. So that allows us to customize and optimize the designs way beyond what you could do if you're building a general purpose enterprise server. So simple things that we can engineer out of our supply chain that can save us millions of dollars at scale. We don't paint our servers. Paint is pretty, but it doesn't add any value to the function of a server, so our specification doesn't require it. We don't put labels on it. We remove blinking lights we don't need. We remove chipsets that we don't need. That allows us to save cost in power and put the power where it's needed, which is capacity, CPU cores, storage, or network bandwidth. By optimizing our designs, we're creating something that looks so different than what customers thought we were deploying.
As part of our talk with Richard, we took one of the offered tours at Microsoft's Redmond Ridge 1 data center lab, where we got to see firsthand the continuously redesigned infrastructure and servers.
We've entered the deployment area, so in the old terminology, a lot of people would have called this a colo. We don't refer to that way anymore. These are deployment areas for capacity. Our storage capacity, our general purpose compute capacity, or whatever specialized workloads we're running.
If you boil it down to what is the one thing that we actually are hearing, when you say what makes the noise?
It's the fans on the servers. So the back of the chassis of the servers are pulling cool air through them to cool down the CPUs and the components inside. We then take that hot air, we'll take it up, we'll mix it back into the cold aisle if we want to warm up the cold aisle, or we'll extract it and take it out through the roof of the building, pull more air in from outside, recycle it that way.
Awesome. So this is a pretty unique sound, and I actually think I could probably put a bed in here and sleep like a baby. I love these kind of sounds. What is this that we're hearing?
So you're hearing the transformers. So we are taking the utility power supply and transforming it down to our medium voltage, which is 480 volts AC, or three-phase for the engineering listeners out there. And that's what we distribute out to the deployment area in what we call pods here. They're known as pods, through our UPS, our uninterruptible power source, that then goes from that into the servers.
With all the lights that are blinking, with all the power and capacity, servers coming in and out, the facility itself from start to finish, and the continuance of it, what do you tell them? What is our story around sustainability? How do we approach that, especially from the very early stages of planning a data center?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because that's a deep subject. And it's something we started talking about on this program with customers about 3.5, 4 years ago. And initially, there was a lot of confusion about what sustainability is, right? Because you immediately just think of power. Sustainability is a lot bigger picture than that. It covers everything from the land you're building on, right the way through to how you decommission at the end of your life cycle and recycle everything that you've been using. So Microsoft has been what they call carbon neutral since 2012. That's a power discussion, right? So we do that by buying carbon offsets and then writing that off against the power that we have to use in areas of the world where they're not generating that power using clean technology, right? So that's how you get carbon neutrality. But we announced a while back that we wanted to get to sustainable. That's different. So that requires generating power in the first instance directly using green, sustainable power. So solar and wind, those technologies. But we're not a power company. So we partner with power companies, and we've been working with them and buying and investing in green technologies that are replacing the older carbon generating oil or coal facilities. It's a big infrastructure, so it takes time to change. We're at 50% sustainable green power now, using the current technologies of wind and solar. But we're investing in other technologies and working with these power companies to help us improve that footprint globally. So even though we're using a lot of that power, we're using that partnership with those power companies to help improve the balance of how that power is generated around the world.
So if I heard you correctly, the part of Microsoft certainly that Chris and I are most familiar with is how is Office 365 growing? How is Azure compute and consumption growing? The business is growing, the business is growing. You're in the midst of that growth, maintaining and improving sustainability.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a key factor to us. And it's great that we have the ability to do this by partnering with our power companies. But it also has a dollars and cents incentive for us to do it. When you're using as much power as we do, if you can save money on that by improving how the power is generated, hydroelectric, solar, wind, then it makes good business sense to do it as well. And at our scale, when you see the power bills come in, that really focuses your mind on what engineering needs to happen. Our data centers now look nothing like we built 10 years ago because we've been able to evolve the designs.
So, you mentioned a lot of customers that come through, and I think one of your other main constituents or clients that you work with are our engineering teams. So talk about that just from if you think about engineering as another persona that needs to know how things work here. They obviously use this as a test bed probably to some degree to make sure their services can run in the new gen of X or Y, whatever you're doing in the data center. But what's that conversation like? A little bit later in the episode, we're going to sit down with a capacity planner and then actually somebody from the SharePoint team who operates SharePoint as a service for the world. What's the discussion with them when they come to this facility?
Yes, so it's a great point. The program that we run is the same tour for a customer, for a Microsoft engineer, for a partner, right? It's the same experience because we need to educate even our own software engineers to what it takes to run their code. If you want to make a change that doesn't follow these standards, you cost us real money physically in the real world by not following those standards. And that was a big part of my re-education. When I came into MCIO, I was not used to that as a concept. You would just buy the servers and you'd put the servers into the rack and then you would moan at how much the operations team was charging you every month for running those servers. Well, now we partner with the engineering teams to help them understand when you make a change in software to something that has a hardware impact, that has a real operational cost over the 3 to 5 years of your service. And that affects us as Microsoft and therefore affects our customers at what we can charge for those services. So by working together and engineering a solution where the software has a standard that we can implement, we can save millions of dollars by optimizing for this cloud service.
So I think it's time to put our hats into something around the data center that's actually been getting some interesting press, I think in a real positive way. But it also is a little bit like, I think, a lot of data centers, things that people don't know about. So we've been playing around, obviously, Microsoft on this new, what I think of as a lab in your world, with Project Natick, which is basically their tagline is 50% of us live near the coast. Why doesn't our data? So we'd love to hear through your eyes, what is Project Natick? And obviously, sort of, where's the focus of it? Why are we doing it at all?
Yeah, this is a fascinating area. It really is. I'm lucky enough to be able to talk to some of the guys on that team, and it's so cool to see this kind of new level of engineering. The important thing to understand is we will still build data centers on land as well. That's not going away anytime soon. Natick solves some very particular problems, or as we're hoping it'll help us solve some very particular problems. And that tagline sums it up, right? Where is the most expensive place in the world to buy land? Large major cities, which is where most of the people are consuming the internet and using our services. So when we build data centers in areas where we can afford the land, miles from anywhere, you incur a technical cost to that, latency in networking terms, right? So with Natick, what it offers is the capability of us being able to put that data much closer to where customers are without impacting the land.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with Project Natick, can we talk a little bit about what the concept is behind taking a data center and putting it offshore or underwater?
If you've got 50% living near the oceans, you've got 3 nautical miles off of the coast there that you could potentially deploy capacity. So that's what we're testing. And in the Orkneys, which is the phase 2 of the program, it's 100% sustainable, right? So this is coming straight from power off the wind farm in the Orkneys. We connect it up and we run capacity in what is effectively a cloud appliance. It will sit there and it will allow us to cache that data close to where customers need it and then connect up to other services that we will build in our traditional style in on-land data centers as well. But it gives us flexibility to keep innovating and adding new capabilities that we simply wouldn't do if we were, or couldn't do, if we were having to build inside these, huge cities.
We don't have people attending it with subs and living under.
So that's why I refer to it as an appliance, right? We aren't going to be sending our maintenance teams down with scuba diving gear to go change a hard drive. That's not how it works. The software is handling the resiliency. So imagine it as like a giant cache. Right, so you're putting capabilities down there, CPU cores, storage, and bandwidth. The software runs on top of that, and it does it in a way that provides the resiliency that it needs by literally striping the data across all of those elements. And we can deploy multiple of those as well, potentially, right? Depending on the capacity we're going for. That way, if the hard drive fails, the software just going to mark it bad, and you watch the capacity drop by a tiny, tiny fraction of a percent. Over the operational lifetime of that service, which, let's say, 3 years, maybe a target, you are able to provide that cache underwater. At the end of that lifetime, you bring it back up, you take the old hardware out, you replace it, recycle it, put the new hardware in, and maybe put it back down again. That's the plan. It's a pure cloud appliance to optimize the capabilities just for that geography, that region.
I certainly see from Microsoft's perspective, there's advantages to being able to deal with issues like heat or being able to deal with issues like real estate costs. What are some of the customer benefits that we think we might be able to deliver with this?
Improved SLAs, so better performance over the network, improved capabilities, right? By having this performance closer, it opens up the possibility for our own engineering teams to write higher performance services that meet whatever the needs of the cloud are going to be in a year, 2 years, 18 years, however far out you want to plan. So it's another string to our bow to be able to keep up with the ever-increasing demand for IT services in the cloud.
But we've talked about data centers on land. We've talked about data centers underwater. When you get this question, what is the cloud? How do you answer that?
We've not done a great job of really explaining what the cloud is. At the end of the day, it's an abstraction layer. It's the exact same concept as when we abstracted mainframe computing to PC computing, when we abstracted physical servers to virtual servers. Cloud is just another level of abstraction. So instead of you being physically tied to a rack running servers in a data center, when you go through that transformation to a cloud, you're moving that through an abstraction layer that gives you flexibility and agility in your business. So we build these massive scale infrastructure globally, and you as a business can consume that where it makes sense for your business without having to pour concrete and connect this infrastructure up and build servers and racks. That's what we're doing at hyperscale so that your business can move data where it makes sense for your data. That is what cloud is. It's an abstraction layer to allow agility for service deployment.
So would you say Azure is the cloud?
Azure is, if you were really pushing me on it, Azure is the operating system for our cloud. We install data centers into Azure. Azure carves up the capacity of those data centers to provide services for our customers. IaaS, PaaS, SaaS.
If anybody wants to learn a little bit more about the Microsoft data centers, where would you send them? And we can put those links in, or is there a Twitter handle or anything that you do individually that we can advertise and point people at?
So yes, if you go to Microsoft.com WAC data centers, that will take you to a lot of information about our global infrastructure. I also have a LinkedIn account. That's where if I find anything interesting around data centers, then I'll post it up there and have some interesting discussions with some of the team up there.
All right. Well, we will make sure to put that in the show notes, and certainly we'll put a couple in there proactively so people can go read about some of the things we talked about today. Thanks for showing us around as well. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
We're going to move from the actual physical data center to actually get the data center ready for services, lots of services. So we're here to talk with Som Coelho, and he's with the Microsoft team that helps prepare basically what I like to think of as bare metal is essentially an open book, and productivity and collaboration are the chapters that follow. So Som, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get where you are in Microsoft? And certainly go right in to tell us a little bit about what you do here.
I'm a lifelong supply chain guy. I've had various roles in operations, in tech manufacturing, even in retail and in consumer devices. And very recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, I guess that's long time in cloud time, I heard about this growing cloud space, and it really sounded like there was no textbook. It's very exciting. It's growing rapidly. And so I found myself moving into the cloud area about 4 years ago. And I was very intrigued because we have to think about a whole bunch of different aspects that are way beyond the normal supply chain. And so that's how I ended up here in capacity planning about 4 years ago.
And do you ever get the question, what is the cloud? And you just say, me. I'm the cloud. Your focus is to drive predictability and reduce cycle time and increase throughput. But we do this uniformly across Microsoft. How do we go about that across the teams and what you do?
I would say our focus is really to make sure that we maintain that perception becomes reality, that we never run out of capacity in the cloud, and people can really rely on having availability for whatever service they're using at Microsoft. Our job behind the scenes is to make sure that we can do that and maintain the growth rates and support the business in the cloud space. The way we do that is we really have to think about 3 time horizons. There's buildings and power stations and data centers that we need to build, which can take anywhere from 1 to 5 years to do. Then there's filling them up with hardware, the bare metal you talked about, which you think about you can influence in the next 1 to 6 to 9 months, and really maintaining that availability as well. And then in the very short-term window, which I think Zach will talk about, is this week, today, next week, our customers are needing capacity. And they're really utilizing stuff we've already made available. And how do we make that available to them? So we're really thinking about 3 time frames in that sense.
So are you primarily focused on the long term? Or how often are you checking in with, boy, we've got what we know is a big customer that's coming on board. We need to prepare for that. Or are we always prepared for what might be a spike or just a long-term growth in terms of projections?
We do focus on both the long term as well as what I call the medium term. Really speaking, how do we support that business? The SharePoint provisioning team is focused on the very short term customer window. And we do have to have different models so that we can predict. If you think about, it's much easier to tell what's going to happen today in the weather forecast versus what's going to happen next year or 5 years from now. So we're driving econometric models, a lot of data science to try to predict what's going to happen and where we need to be positioning land and data centers on the longer horizon. My team is really focused on filling them up in the 12-month window to make that capacity available for customers to use in the shorter term.
For me, it's always fascinating, certainly, to know that we're thinking that far in advance and to know some of the things that you have to be prepared for. I always find that fascinating. I know on the marketing side, at least for SharePoint, we've promoted at our recent conference some of the numbers of having 400,000 customer organizations using SharePoint and Office 365. Storage growth is growing at a 200% rate, and we've got about 70% of all seats that are using SharePoint. 70% of those are actually in Office 365. So what does that mean for hardware projections?
There are 3 elements we think about in terms of hardware projections. One is really taking the growth rates and projections from SharePoint and all our other businesses and really focusing on what can we predict in terms of the growth, as well as what are customers asking us to do in terms of, say, migrating into a new Go local that we're setting up. The second area is to cover all the aspects of co-location, latency, and availability with all the services that are needed together to be able to deliver the hardware. And then the last one is to be closely tied with the new features that are coming up in SharePoint, and also how we want to make sure to bake in new efficiencies. So you kind of combine all these factors, and then you come up with a plan across the data center, power, space, network, and servers to support that growth rate.
When you said that upcoming features, may dictate a little bit of what you do differently inside the data center, do you have an example?
I can talk more about a Go local scenario. When we launched France, for example, and there were a whole bunch of customers who were supported in the European region, but they wanted to have their data in their country. And when we're planning about how much data center space to buy or how much servers to plan for to support that business, we have to think about how to think about the new business that is coming in, as well as existing customers who want to come into the region and move their business either from a security or from a latency point of view, or just the mental relief that is going to be in their country. country. So we can use that to plan. And that's where we partner very closely with the engineering team developing the service so we can figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I remember when we talked about Go Local just in general, that was a huge feature for us to be able to market, obviously, to those different industries or different customers in those regions where the data sovereignty was super important. And it was almost a blocker to actually adopting the cloud. Cloud had everything they wanted, everything they needed. It just wasn't in the right place. And to see Microsoft then step up to Canada, France, Japan, China, in those regions to essentially build new data centers that are closer and, of course, within their guidelines and their principles. That's a huge feature for you. And for us, it was just a huge unblocker for enabling a lot of those customers. So I totally get it now. And I could see where something like that would be not just a, hey, we're going to light up this feature, but something that would take a lot of unique planning and, of course, coordination amongst the teams. So I think in your world, that adage of the chicken before the egg before the chicken, I think it's always the egg comes before the chicken, the egg being the data centers and the servers and everything, and the chicken being our service and, of course, the customer's use of it. Whether or not we continue with this analogy, I don't blame you if we don't. Can you share best practices when it comes to procurement? You're not just going down to the local store, buying a few servers and hauling it back in a pickup truck. What does that look like, procurement?
Yeah, we're definitely not. At the scale we are, you can see the Microsoft overall cloud business is going and, doubling annually. And in various services like SharePoint and so on, you even talked about the 200% storage growth. It was way beyond taking anything in a pickup truck. Besides that, we take security and chain of custody and things like that very seriously. And it would just be a complete no-no to even do something like that or bring racks or hardware like that to a data center. So what we do is we are driving a lot of planning scenarios for every individual business and then the overall picture. We are sharing that visibility with our partners to make sure that everything down to components, cables, receiving capacities are all set up to support the projected pace of the business. And then the second thing we do is very consciously drive risk buys and try to do a ROI analysis to make sure that we can balance what we think is going to be the growth rate, create some headroom for the unpredictable, and still kind of grow the business efficiently. And then the last thing is we are driving a very strong fungibility and pooling program down at the subcomponent levels to make sure that we have those parts available for a rapid response to any kind of customer need or any kind of supply event that may happen behind the scenes. So we can maintain, I think we're promising a 3.9 availability to our customers. But if you look at the Office Trust Center, you can see we are hitting 4 nines for the last several quarters. And I want to keep it that way.
We'll put a link to the Trust Center because I think it's important for a number of things that we've talked about in this episode, but especially the visibility. We're pretty transparent about what our targets are, what our promises are, and then, of course, how we deliver on them. Yeah. Transparency is deeply important. And what I'm hearing from you is it's not just the data center is secure, your data is secure, but everything in how we build out the data center, bring information, cables, people into the data center goes through the same rigor of being certain in terms of what are the people, what are the projects, what are the products. I'm sure the long, long list of what gets checked before it gets lit up at the data center, and of course, how that then plays into protection of our customers and their data.
And the same thing on the other end as well, in terms of taking that hardware back out. There's a chain of custody, making sure that things are destroyed and turned down in a very secure way.
What is that cycle like? I've never really thought about the decommissioning of a server or even maybe to something that our users on the podcast could think in terms of the actual where my data is stored. What happens? And whether you can talk about the specifics, but just the rigor that we go through if we do make changes like that.
Yeah, every asset is tracked throughout its life from the time we issue a PO for it through its installation in one of our data centers and then the subsequent removal based on its optimal lifespan. And there's a whole decommissioning program which is meant to migrate users to the newest and more efficient hardware, which has more capabilities, and then securely remove, destroy anything that could potentially have any kind of customer data on it and make sure that that's completely removed without any chance of a loss.
Gotcha. So from the very beginning of even planning and thinking all the way through, I think there's a focus of what our readiness is to meet and stay ahead of the demand.
Yep.
But everything I'm hearing from you is there's this obsession with customers, being able to keep them protected at every mile. You pretty much touched on it. I'd just love to hear in your own words, when you're thinking through left to right, how often is the customer at the forefront of your mind?
It is in the forefront of our mind all the time. It's the first thing we think about, and their needs and the dependencies they're taking on the cloud to run their businesses. And so we are really working to ensure the highest service level availability for our customers, whether it's making trade-offs between decisions or parts which are coming in to maintain availability for SharePoint and all our other customers. We're also thinking about our measurements from a customer perspective. We don't measure ourselves from just internal, did we deliver something on time? We're looking at it from, is the service available to our customers all the time? And that's kind of driving our measurement process. The third thing we're doing is really using machine learning and other algorithms to predict availability. When we want to make a promise to a customer, we want to make sure we can hit it. Or we want to be able to tell them that there's a certain window in which that's going to happen. And so we're investing a lot in machine learning to be able to make really high confidence promises to our customers for all our services. And then the last thing we're doing is we've created centers of excellence or converged tooling and capabilities which our various services can use so that that can help them, whether it's forecasting, whether it's planning, whether it's appropriate buffer methodologies, teardown processes like you alluded to, so that we can have the best-in-class process and really scale with our customer growth.
That's awesome. Everything that we're talking about in this is all about scale, and it's all about the customer scale and our own ability to scale with customers. So, Som, appreciate your time today coming in, sharing a little bit more about what you do. We've found a few highlights of what your team offers that is public information that we'll link to, and certainly anytime that you've got something that you want to share, we're always here to help amplify. Well, thanks for joining us. Hope that you had fun coming to the Intro Zone, and I certainly appreciate you coming and sharing more.
Thank you for having me.
We talked with the data center team, where Richard Harrison showed us the heart of a data center production lab. Now we get to learn about how Microsoft's SPO service engineering finishes build-out and readiness for customer use. Mark sat down with Zach Rosenfield.
So we're lucky to have Zach Rosenfield in the studio with us. Zach is a principal group program manager here at Microsoft, and you head up the Spin team. So let's dive into a little bit about who you are and what your team focuses on.
Yes. So first about me, I have been with SharePoint for 12 years now. All of my time with Microsoft has been spent with the SharePoint OneDrive organization. I've worked with you, Mark, for basically all of it.
All that time, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's like we're in it for a baker's dozen, one more year. And
well, yeah,
and
that's right. We get a free year. It's how that works.
I like it.
Yeah, so, exciting stuff working on the platform. I basically was the sort of first person to work on SharePoint Online, really there at the beginning to figure out how multi-tenancy would work in the SharePoint product, which then evolved into us actually building and running the service ourselves. So I always like to say it as I've bought every machine that is in SharePoint Online. Is a good way to
And those are not small checks, right? You don't need to say any numbers or anything. But,
it definitely makes my home life a little difficult because everything at home now all of a sudden feels like a different scale.
Yeah, you're like, hey, we can get a couple houses. That's no problem.
That's right.
There's data centers to compare to.
Exactly.
Well, awesome. We want to learn more about your team as well. So your team is called the Spin team. What does Spin stand for?
So we're the SharePoint infrastructure team. So, SharePoint, everything SP.
Yeah.
So SharePoint infrastructure. And my team in particular really thinks about sort of core fundamentals for the service platform. So we provide the storage platform for SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, but also other parts of Office 365 that want to store files, particularly Office files, and provide that content safely and securely to their users. So we think about performance, availability, network, how do we actually scale and build out regionally as well as around the world and provide this content in a way that meets the certifications and requirements of different organizations, different governments.
And you're also the team that's behind doing a lot of the performance work as well. So I remember one big feature that we brought was, you would go and create a team site, and it would take generally between 5 to 10 minutes. And that was pretty good compared to on-prem. You're now down to within the 10 to 15 second range, and you can tell me if you're even getting better.
Yeah, no, we're less than 10 seconds. I like to actually make it sure. And obviously, won't get into percentiles and all those things. People will experience time certainly better than that. But we're pretty proud of where we've come in the last couple of years in terms of performance, not just in site creation, but also in file upload, download. Really, really competitive in the market and feel actually like a leader in many areas.
That's great. Well, I mean, it's a ton ton of great work behind the scenes, and obviously when all the end user features load up on top of that, that it's nice performance, that it's scalable. Customers of all sizes, literally from 5 people up to several 100,000. It's pretty amazing, and especially across the whole world. And we're talking a lot of data centers, a lot of farms, but a lot of great services that are to millions of customers, which is wonderful. One of the things we last talked about with Som, and he suggested that we talk to you about, and then we'll really get into the meat of what you do. He had mentioned that there are times where you actually promote features, not just to him, but that we're planning for our customers, that actually require capacity planning to change, or you think it might. And he said that we should ask you, what is an example of 1 or 2 features that you can think of that's not just where we should plan as a team and how to message that out, but really to go back to the team at the data center level to help prepare them? What was 1 or 2 of those features?
Yeah, there's a really interesting problem that we have at Microsoft, which is sort of the scale at which we do everything. We never get that sort of test run or that pilot experience where we're just going to try it out, see how people use it. And it leads to some really interesting problems that the data center team in particular feels because they have really long lead times. They can't just manufacture machines faster or build new data centers quicker. And so we really have to get ahead of those features. So good examples might be known folder migration, which is just coming out now, something that would actually change the amount of data that users in the population will bring to us. Also, if we go and we decide we're going to move into a new market, say France, we all of a sudden sort of have to project out how much data will be in the France data center. And then multi-geo was another great example, a big one where we all of a sudden sort of had to decide where we thought people would move data that was already in our service in one place to another, and then think about how that would impact our footprint, both our existing data centers and how they would grow, as well as these new areas that all of a sudden would get subsegments of these companies moved into them at a different pace than we normally would.
So I know a lot about you by nature of that we've worked together, and I, again, have seen you grow from role to role and really grow your team really well. And I thought instead of me just sort of thinking through what are some things that would be interesting in doing some research on what you've done recently, I came across a session that you did at SPC 18. And that's titled, your title, The Secret to Getting the Best Experience Out of SharePoint Online Mythbuster Edition. So, of course, I went right to the TV show, and if this were visually, we would throw up the ka-chow, myth busted. So as being that last mile to the customer before they sign on the dotted line, yes, I'm wanting Microsoft as a vendor, they have a few myths. So
this really just are sort of the most frequently asked questions that we hear from most customers,
Yep.
and the biggest source of angst, and rightly so. These are service fundamentals. These are the things that just have to go right. So they are good, smart questions. We just hear them enough that we really felt we needed to do a whole session on them.
So on this particular episode, we might get 5 FAQs from you.
Okay.
All right, so let's save one, but we're going to hit the 4 big ones. First one is the first myth. SharePoint Online is not ready for my scale. Is that true? Is Office 365 as we know it today, is it ready for business, big business?
So this is one that I fortunately do hear less and less these days, but it's still a point of angst, especially amongst our largest customers, where people think that they're unique. And everyone is a little unique, but when it comes to the scale of things, it's not really the key issue that people are really running into. And rather, there are bottlenecks in the system that people do need to think about and make sure that they're prepared for. But I just like to stress how much the Microsoft side of the equation is really not going to be the scale bottleneck. We have some extremely large customers. I can't talk about most of them in detail. I do generally talk about the Microsoft tenant when I give these talks, and I show how rapidly it has grown. I think we're nearing 3 petabytes of data just within the Microsoft tenant.
Whoa.
And it grows at a phenomenal pace. Hundreds of thousands of users. If you include the external sharing that we do here at Microsoft, it's nearly 500,000 active
Just
users.
on that number alone, if there were another customer that either does have that, we can't name them, or will require that, that has never been a blocker for us as far as...
It is not, and I like to say MSIT is not the largest tenant in our service. Okay. There are many tenants who are larger than Microsoft on multiple different data points, so it's just sort of a good example, and it's whether MSIT wants me to or not, not, I feel like I can talk about it.
I think MSIT has given you the go-ahead a couple times. They like to share what they're doing.
So they're doing lots of actually really interesting, complicated things, and it's a great validation for us in terms of our scale, and we feel really good about how well that works and how much of a non-issue the actual amount of content you're bringing, the number of users that you're bringing, really making that work really well is definitely doable. That said, when you're moving data from on-prem to the cloud, it's a little different if you're going cloud to cloud, but if you're going on-prem to the cloud, you've introduced a new pathway between you and the service. And so making sure that everything between our service and your business is clear and big enough, it is often a big challenge. And so we generally, when talking about is Microsoft ready, we actually want to shift the conversation to is your data highway ready? Because it doesn't matter if we have a great service and your corporate network is great, if everything in between is too small to let it fit through. So really thinking about how do your users get from their location to us is really important. When you think about the crowding problem, we have built, and in many ways overbuilt our data centers to be prepared for an incredible amount of surge in traffic. And so there's really no way for everybody in between to have as much capacity as we have once you get to our data center. So how you get to our data center, making sure you get to our data center, or in the case of CDNs and the like, actually skipping that long trip altogether really helps. And actually making sure that you are prepared for that is really the biggest concern when folks are thinking about how to onboard, and especially if they're going to pump a lot of data from point A to point B, spending a lot of time thinking about that migration process.
Awesome. So I think myth number 1, busted?
I hope so.
If we could do a little sound cue.
Busted!
Okay. So second myth, it will be slow to use. People always think performance, whether they've used SharePoint before, or they're just thinking about the service all up. If you think about, are we the tortoise or the hare in this race in the data center?
I wish there was a straightforward answer to that question. Performance has been probably the most challenging thing that I've worked on at Microsoft. And I think it is the most challenging thing for 2 reasons. First of all, performance is really art. It's not true engineering in the most traditional way. Obviously, engineering is a big part of it. But your definition of performance, what you're trying to achieve with performance, and how you get there, there's often many different ways to end up at the same result. That said, the other unique thing about SharePoint that really no other service out there does is we give an incredible amount of control to our users in terms of the ability to customize and do things as they see fit. And this enables customers to do amazing things, but it also means they are responsible for a lot of the performance aspects as well. And so this has been an incredible challenge for us, and in terms of figuring out how to not take away some of that customization strength, but really put the right guardrails in place so that people do the right thing. I know I push it a lot. We have a website, aka.ms/tune, Tune, which has a bunch of our sort of best practices. And I always like to tell people, we say they're recommendations, but they're really must-dos. And we also just get a lot of confusion. People sort of are like, you let me do this, 500 web parts on a page. Shouldn't it be super fast? And it's really not. We give you that ability and that power. And we see people do a lot of things that if you were just a web designer thinking about how do I make a highly performant page, you'd think that person was crazy. And so how do we put the right guardrails in place? I think our modern experiences are really focused on trying to help people do the right thing up front. But I can't recommend aka.ms/tune enough. We have guidance there. We have features like the ability for you to use our content delivery networks for free. So we pay the bill for our customers to put any data they want into a content delivery network and build rich portals that are super fast. And we still generally see pretty low adoption of those features, which are really critical. Can't explain enough just how important they are.
Yeah, just to take advantage of something like a CDN network. Usually a customer will ask, I have my own CDN, what should I do with it? But for those customers that don't ask that question, to optimize and take advantage of that is huge. That also being said, I know that there's been a ton of work at the file optimization level, the page optimization level, the stream team, who of course is a number of times a part of our pages with the way that the playback works and where they serve the video from and how it works. I always think in terms of performance, and I know that Tune site is going to get tuned up right before, we're right around the corner to Ignite. So we're getting ready to have that documentation be updated. And you said the thing that is going to go on there really, which is the first thing, is think about moving to modern. If you have classic sites, move to a modern site. If you're using some, classic development patterns, move to the modern patterns. But, from your perspective, you're doing everything you can on the back end to make the service tuned up and ready for those folks to then be able to take advantage of it.
Yes, and I feel really proud of all the work we've done. We've been able to take advantage of being Microsoft and having this global footprint to deliver some technology that really only companies of our scale can provide. And so we have definitely moved the needle significantly on file performance, on page performance, by leveraging that global footprint and distributing content faster than ever before. The great example is some of the work we've done delivering our files through the Azure front door. So we leveraged Azure's network, which is all around the world, to use Microsoft's private backbone to send data between points, making it so that where your data is stored and where you are at that moment is somewhat irrelevant, and actually making it so that file open times, whether you're sitting next to the data center or you're on the other side of the world, are almost the same. And it actually takes away the penalty of collaborating with people who aren't necessarily sitting next to you. And so, as someone who has team members in China and in Norway, it's important for us to make sure that no single user suffers just because the data has to be stored next to one of us and can't be stored with all of us.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know that our customers benefit. I know from me either demoing or using the technology on my own through MSIT, I've seen huge improvements. And sometimes I know that I'll be demoing sometimes from Europe, from our Chicago data center, which is, pretty decent experience. I've never felt like, I'm giving this audience kind of a slow experience and I'm tapping my toes. It's really good.
My new bad habit is whenever anyone's demoing SharePoint and they open a file, I count the number of seconds for the file to open.
Yeah.
It's been a nice change of late to see how quickly that stuff is really working. And really, again, you're not paying that penalty for where you're demoing versus where you have your demo tenant set up. And so it's an exciting shift over the last couple of years.
Good. Well, I know a lot of the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing. And I think just opening a little bit of a window into, it's a big thing that we care about. We invest a ton in it. So myth number 2, easily busted in my mind, well documented as well. And certainly if anybody had heard this podcast or if they've seen you speak, that's one where, you can go on for a while. So should we give it, you give it the busted.
The busted?
Yeah.
I have to do busted.
Good. That was good. All right. Third myth, my data is not safe. This is one that I still get, and I am not your deep security expert, but I know that there's a lot that I can point to, a lot that I can present, at least the top level stuff, and then talk about something that's well documented. But from your perspective, we hear this one through our R&D. We really push in terms of it's a huge area of investment. But how do you sum up our security for SharePoint in the context of Office 365?
Absolutely. And I actually differentiate. I say there's 2 parts to this myth. There's the safety of my data. How do I know it's safe with you? How do I know that you have backups and the like? Not all file storage services actually do backups.
Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Makes my heart jump a little bit.
It does.
I'm a good fit in this role because I'm a little bit low risk as a person. And so I like to take that same approach to customer data.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously also the security aspect. So the security stuff could go on for far too long. We do all the best industry practices. We have ensured that we can keep our service up to date, and no matter how big we get, we can get the fixes we need out extremely fast. We have a round-the-clock security team. I always recommend, if you ever have an opportunity to see Matt Swan give a talk.
The red hat, blue hat, or red pill, blue pill?
Yes. Super amazing stuff that they do in terms of both how they validate, how they pen test, as well as the tools that they build to detect when things go astray. Like you almost can't make a mistake in the data center anymore. Even if it wasn't malicious, they're going to know and they're going to come find you.
In this one is 2 things I wanted to ask you about. I think this is the most brilliant thing that your team did to improve the service literally week after week, if not year after year for sure. And that was putting the engineering team on call for issues. That could be just things that happen, physics, nature, of course, bugs and fixes, or just customers doing crazy stuff and needing our assistance. When it comes to that level, and I'm assuming you've been an OCE many times.
Yes.
OCE being the person who gets the phone call at 2 a.m. if the phone rings. And whatever the issue, I don't want you to have to pin to something.
I've had some fun ones.
I'm sure. From a security perspective, if something needed to happen specific to customers, I know we have a feature called Lockbox. Whether you've used that directly or not, or just your experience as an OCE, through the lens of security, the benefits of having you there so that we learn from things and the product gets better, but the actual day of or that 2 a.m. call, what does that look like in how we treat it and what we can do to resolve things, but with customers, so it's always in a secure manner?
So, as you said, it's super critical that we put the actual engineers who write the code in front of the issues so they can experience them firsthand. It's also great just because engineers don't like to do the same thing twice. So you wake someone up for a problem, they're going to figure out how to not have to wake up for that problem again. And so they put a lot of energy into how do they address it and how do they address it with the least amount of friction. So I like Lockbox. Lockbox is the ability for a customer to really control when people can touch their data, have access to their data. It's basically an approver model. The result is our engineers put a ton of energy in how do they fix and diagnose issues without ever actually having to see the data. And so that data is encrypted with special keys that they can't access without that customer approval. And so there are very rare occasions where in order to diagnose a customer issue, that's really the key scenario where we need access to your data. You call us and you say this web page, it's not rendering right and I don't know what's going on. Somebody might need to go take a look. And so we actually have to request approval and your administrator will actually tell us that we can go do that. And it's for a fixed period of time. So we need to go get in there and fix it. But otherwise, we spend a ton of time and energy thinking about how do we prevent those things? How do we auto-heal those things? How do we detect issues that you're having before you have to actually tell us ourselves? And so we spend a lot of time on that automation, on the anomaly detection, looking for people having a higher rate of errors and the like. And then in the moment, generally we think we can fix most issues without ever actually looking at your data. And features like Lockbox really incentivize to do that.
I think it's great, and I think it's the right thing to do, and I think we're very transparent. We talked a little bit earlier about the Trust Center and anything and everything that people can read there, but that's truly is the manual that we follow, not just that we put out there and try to follow. I think you follow it religiously, which leads me to think between 5 and 10 years ago, you guys might have had bloodshot eyes in the morning. Some things might have gone wrong. I think this is the best well-rested engineering team I've ever seen now.
It's definitely a different world. The types of issues that we have learned over the years, run sort of the full spectrum. I think sort of my always go-to story for when I was on call was when a ship cut an undersea cable. Those are the types of things we weren't quite expecting and, having to learn. And obviously we have redundant lines, but there's all sorts of interesting issues in various countries, in various parts of the world that do impact how we think about things. And we've been able to leverage those experiences to really build a system that, to your point, kind of mostly runs itself. It runs itself.
Selves is right. We got a lot of data centers, a lot of people involved, and I think everybody works really well together, obviously on behalf of customer. So
shifting the conversation back, though, in terms of data safety, which is actually sort of the thing that people really ask us about more, I think that we have a lot of experience in security, and there's lots of great data out there on our security. Data safety is also extremely important to us, and we have so many copies of the data that as I said, I can't believe any service wouldn't have a similar level of safety on data. And we do make sure that we have your files available to you. They go into the recycle bin when deleted for 93 days. We also shipped Files Restore for OneDrive last year at Ignite. Super exciting feature, allowing you to roll back in time your OneDrive for Business to any point in the last 30 days, down to an individual file change. Great for protecting from ransomware. And then with the latest release of Windows, it actually has a full end-to-end process where if Windows determines you've been impacted by ransomware, it will address the issue. A little pop-up shows up. You click that. It brings you right to your OneDrive to restore your files. It's a really great end-to-end experience that makes those types of issues really a non-event.
So I think data secure, file secure, secure access. People should feel good about who can access the data center, who can get to their content. We definitely take it from every angle. Anything that you can think of that we don't consider for security?
Oh, man, I hope not. No, I feel really impressed by our security team and the energy and excitement, and I definitely think that we are industry leading in this perspective.
Okay. Well, I think we'll put the stamp on this one. It's definitely busted, and busted. Any angle, any depth layer of security will just bust it at every level. So let's move to the fourth one, which is the one I think you and I over the years have shared messaging out. You, of course, take it on to adjust the limits. But let's talk about the fourth myth. SharePoint has all these limits. Some really big, some really small, but customer perception is that it's limiting. So some of these things we have, and we've got a great web page that I'll link to in the show notes that talks about the SharePoint Online boundaries and limits. It's a pretty popular article as far as people referencing. But take that from not only what is the perception that people have, what's the real myth in your perspective, but how do we address it?
Yes. The limits, it's always a little bit of a difficult conversation. So limits generally exist just to ensure safety. We want to make sure people do the right thing. And there's obviously this give and take. This goes back to our perf conversation. How many web parts can I put on a page? Well, there's different times when it calls for different things. And so if we put a limit in place, people all of a sudden feel like they can't do something. So we try to get limits out of the way. We try to make sure that when you're just trying to do work, you don't run into any of these limits. And that's where you see us doing max path. You see us enabling files with pound and percent. You see us changing how we think about lists and list view thresholds, the single most confusing thing in SharePoint.
But it has the coolest name for how we're addressing it. Predictive indexing.
Yes, we sound very cool with our predictive indexing. It's one of these big, again, to that customization element of SharePoint, we're basically letting our customers construct SQL queries. It's an incredible level of empowerment that rarely exists in a piece of software. And so how do we make that safe? How do we make it so that people can still do what they want, but do it in a way that works? And so that's been a long journey, the predictive indexing. I think the list limits have been in the product as long as I've been here. So I'm really excited to see this journey we've taken where we've really been going after each and every limit, making sure that any of the ones that get in the way of individual users, making sure that they go away, making sure that they're not a problem. My favorite one that I worked on, and I know you were excited about, was when we took the site collection size limit.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was 100 gigs at one point. Now it's 25 terabytes.
And it was even smaller for individual OneDrive. So if you think about my personal area...
Oh, I remember 7 gigs was our initial shipping number. I remember thinking that was a big deal.
Big deal. And for a while, it was not used. Like still 7 gigs wasn't filled up immediately, which I think is the pattern. I don't know if that's where you were going. I'm just going to throw it in there.
Yeah, no, I always love there's this interesting human behavior that we see and we sort of get to speculate about and we don't always know. And obviously this is about the world at scale, not necessarily an individual's behavior, but there definitely is a pattern change. Every time you change the limit for how much people can put into their site, it actually changes what they put into that site. And we've gone very large, and now we're getting the opposite feedback from administrators telling me, oh, you know, my new hires are putting movies and music into their sites, and I don't want that. How do I actually bring the numbers back down? So there's this interesting give and take, and the human behavior is always sort of interesting to look at.
Yeah. I thought in that area, one of the biggest things certainly is usually storage as well that goes along with that. And the perception is there, but there's also just we had the allocation versus usage. And that was a big feature I know that you guys built. Instead of admin saying you get X amount or a certain percentage of the what's possible, now it's based on usage. So you can get up to a certain amount of storage, but until you use it, it's still available to everybody. Where before it felt like their storage was running out much quickly. And the best part on the feedback of when we released that feature was, whoa, I just got a ton of storage back because they saw their number go up in the admin center.
Yes.
That was really cool. We knew that was going to happen, so we put that in the messaging. But to then hear that as feedback of like, thank you, Microsoft, for more storage, where we were really just giving them what they weren't using.
Yes. No, that was a bit life-changing in terms of how administrators operated and thought about the amount of storage available to them. It also just, again, changed behavior. So instead of administrators having to give out small, tiny little sites because they wanted to make sure everyone got their fair share, they kind of were able to let the system organically grow where the usage needed to be and not worry about actually handing out those, sort of tokens as needed.
Yep. And we've got the kind of technology in place where they can put the governance in place so that people who should be able to create can use what they need when they're done. They can obviously go through a cycle of cleansing those sites out. So there's the governance side of it, but it's no longer a blocker that if they want to open that door to let their users do what they need to do and not be worried about the limits, that's, of course, very empowering.
Yes, and not having to actually think about, I'm going to move stuff so that I save space, or I'm going to delete stuff to save space, actually just eliminating those needs. We like to think that we're growing with our user base and really expanding as needed.
And I think that's very true. I know that there's always, at the highest level, people are asking for certain amounts. You said how much, we use at MSIT, so there isn't that barrier. There is the, work with us, and we'll certainly make it happen. And for the world, we're certainly increasing the limits year over year in what needs to be based on what we see. And I think the last thing I wanted to touch on here was you actually get a window into how people are using the service. When it was an on-premises product, we did our best to hit the highest limits possible and know what people were doing 2 years ago, and then in 2 years deliver something that was better than what they had, year over year, or 3 years over 3 years, if that's even a way to say it. But in the service, you probably meet on a monthly basis, I'm just going to guess. You meet all the time, but on a recurring basis to at least say, what is the service being used for? We can see the pattern that people need more or are hitting more of the threshold than we're comfortable with.
Yes, we love the ability to see in near real time what people are doing and what issues they're running into. We study it religiously, and I love the fact that people can effectively vote with their feet. We can actually see them try things and see what does and does not work. And that's a big part, since we're on the topic of limits, it's a big part of how we prioritize which limits we go after. Folks should come by and tell us about a limit, and we know that no one's anywhere near that number in the real world. On other sides, pound and percent's a great one. We ship that feature, and instantly we see all the files that had been failing to sync into the service or upload into the service all of a sudden show up. And so we actually could watch those failures turn to success as that feature rolled out.
So I think that one's comfortably busted, and I can very much say year over year we keep busting that one based on real usage need. And I actually think we've eroded that perception to the point of it's more of, hey, I'm in the service, how can I use it, versus I'm thinking about the service.
It's a journey. I actually like to say that the limits we do post today, there are some that are really, again, moving into sort of that strong recommendation that you just think about it in a different way. The great example there is subsites. We're really pushing people to use site collections. They're more scalable. We have hub sites. We have all sorts of great rich features and a better permission model to really think about at that scope. And so not building the one site with all your content in it is something we actually recommend. And instead of getting folks to push on that limit, we'd rather see them move to site collections.
And what's nice about that is that's actually been what a lot of our MVPs and our partners in that space, that's what they've been saying for years. It's just good, clean information architecture. And it's great to know that we're building it for that. So can we do this one together?
Okay.
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
Busted!
Get those limits out of here. So, Zach, fun as always, obviously, to talk to you, not just here in the studio, but always. And glad that you're helping keep the service big, fast, safe, and feeling limitless, which is, again, I know what the Spin team is all about. So if people want to find out about what you and your team are doing, where would people normally go? I don't know if you are active on social in any way, but certainly blogs and whatnot.
Yes, I mean, I try to use Twitter as I can. So Z Rosenfield is my handle.
Yeah.
I think our team often just takes pleasure in being a key part of every feature that rolls out. And so, I say look to the roadmaps, look to the great announcements that Mark sends, that Stephen Rose sends. Mm-hmm. We feel like we're a part of all those things. But I definitely will on social media make sure it's known when my team has a little extra special role.
Okay. And the site that you mentioned earlier, we'll put a link, aka.ms/tune.
Yes.
Know that a lot of Zach's thinking, his team's work, and of course their writing and helping get the word out goes through that website as well. So we'll definitely link to that. So thank you for your time. Hopefully you had some fun sharing what you know.
Absolutely.
And I hope that you will stick around. We've got a section, like you had mentioned, FAQs. I know you just shared 4 big ones, and we want to know what your 5th one is.
Okay.
So stick around and do FAQ section with us.
Perfect.
Awesome. We're finally at my favorite part of our show, where our experts answer your frequently asked questions. At the table with Chris and myself are our guests Som Coelho, Zach Rosenfield, and Richard Harrison. So, Som, tell us, what is your most frequently asked question, and of course, your answer?
I think one question which comes up often is, how do we make sure all the resources that we are planning for are available together? And so when you think about, for example, Azure storage or compute capacity or network or power, all of these need to come together to make the service available to the customer. And so the answer to that is that we are tied our planning models for these various resources together. Some cases, it's very dependent planning. Some cases, we want to make sure we don't run out of, say, for example, a data center space, which could take 2-3 years to build, and we'll carry a little bit of more security on that versus something that we can get in a week. And we're always trying to drive cycle times down so that we can scale and make sure everything is available together at the right time to the customers.
I love it, because on our end, we talk a lot about the Microsoft Cloud as kind of a general platform that we all play into. And it's true. All these services certainly do come together, whether it's integrated experiences or just sharing the data center. And to use that analogy a little bit, from what you just said, it sounds like the data center is a one Microsoft push, an effort where we all better be working really closely together to plan, to build out, to decommission, and of course, when we talk to Zach, how he works across all the different teams. So it's great to hear from a data center perspective.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for your question. Thanks for your answer. Zach, you gave us 4 FAQs in the structure of this episode, but we know you always get a ton of questions when you present or just when you're traveling around. People are always interested in the service versus the product. What's your frequently asked question recently, and most importantly, what's your answer?
The most common thing right now is actually a little bit of a revisit to the second myth, talking about performance. People often show up after a talk and say, hey, look, you just demoed something really great. The experience looked great. It was fast. It was snappy. I always like to remind them I'm on Wi-Fi in some hotel conference room, and it still works great. Why do I not experience that? And in fact, even here at Microsoft, folks tell us, hey, it's great when I'm home, but it's terrible when I'm at my office. And so just sort of this perception that, sure, you tell me it's fast, why is that not what I'm experiencing? And this is where we really have to stress that performance is all about the weakest link. And so if any single thing in the pipeline between you and the service is broken, you're going to have real problems. And it takes an incredible amount of energy, especially on the behalf of your administrators, to go and really measure the experience at each point of your company. And so we always tell people, go to the furthest point in your network right before you connect to the internet, plug in, talk to SharePoint, see how that works. It's usually going to be pretty great. And then start working your way in. We get so many escalations. It's actually 90% of our performance escalations are solved with a networking change on the customer side.
Internally on their end.
And so, and it's usually not profound. It's usually one proxy, one device, one branch office that has a problem. And we're heavily invested, we hope, in actually being able to provide some of those insights to our customers because we are able to collect some of that data. But in the end, right now, it really involves understanding your corporate network, knowing what you're using. We have customers who, have 7 proxies in between every user and us. If any one of those is out of date, is poorly configured, has the wrong setting, it's all going to break.
So I like to think of it also in terms of, think about when you boot your machine for the first time. If you boot it at home or maybe at a coffee shop, it boots pretty fast. If you boot it on the corporate network, it's going to go through a couple of checkpoints and say, oh, we're on the corporate network. Check these policies. Are they up to date with what we have as IT that will then go down and apply? There's just a couple more checkpoints. So it seems to load a little bit differently, a little bit slower. Same machine, and I have a pretty new machine. And I think what you just described is something very similar. When you're in the corporate network, and again, pointing back to the Tune website, I know that we've got a lot of information about tuning your network. So there's a lot that people can do if they're experiencing performance. Certainly give us a call. We'll help and work you through it. But that there's a lot that they can do that most likely will unblock them. I'm assuming a lot of those calls, by the end of the call, they're in good shape.
Yes, definitely. It can be serious work. It can be a challenge. Occasionally, it does involve having to upgrade some hardware, which is not everyone's favorite activity. But it's really critical, and it becomes a bottleneck. You just can't get through it. And especially when you're talking about SharePoint and Collab and people editing documents back and forth, you want to make sure that's extremely fast.
Awesome.
Richard, with the tours you give the data center, there must be a ton of questions you receive, but what's the most common question that you get?
Quite often, the most common question at the end of the tour is, wow, what's next? So we've talked about Project Natick. We're not done. There is a lot of innovation that is still coming. We are partnering with some of the brightest minds in Microsoft research and with our partners around the globe. There's a lot of innovation here as the cloud evolves, as demand increases, as more services are required. The innovation is accelerating. So it's a really interesting time to be involved in this technology. And just watch this space.
Great, thank you. We'll be sure to check back with you in a few years when you can actually tell us about what you're secretly working on now, and at which point there'll be something else you're secretly working on, and we'll keep coming back to pester you at least every 3 years.
And it will be the most amazing game of data center leapfrog. So certainly we think it's fascinating what you're working on. We look forward to learning more about it consistently. Chris, what is your most frequently asked question?
The question I've been getting a lot in the last month is, what version is the cloud running? Which is a fascinating one. And if you come from a traditional data center architecture, you were running Windows 2000 and you were running SharePoint 2003 Service Pack 1, and you could reduce the current state of operations to a single number. When you think about the cloud, the only way I can say what version are you running is now. We have a continuous series of updates to a broad range of services, Exchange, SharePoint, etc. At any moment in time, you're running on the most recent version of all of those that we've gotten to you. There are other things that are still being worked on. There are things that were delivered to you a week ago. So it is continuously evolving, just like an organic, living, breathing creature. There are some cells in our bodies that are brand new and some cells that have been with us since the day we were born. And the cloud is very much that way.
Yeah, and I've heard the term evergreen, always on, always, the most readily available with the latest features. And I think a lot of what comes with that is probably what's behind a lot of that question that you get is the change management aspect. But knowing what version just, only allows you to know, well, was that feature available at that given time? Or will it be available in X version? And the answer is...
It depends.
Yes, it depends.
But what's interesting is, though, it does get back to why people are asking the question in the first place, because they want to know how to prepare for it. And so the best tip I can give around that is to follow the Office 365 Message Center, where when things are about to be released into your tenant or have recently been released to your tenant, you can go in and see the complete manifest of everything that's there.
And there's just one thing that I was just thinking of when you were answering the question was, I haven't heard the term of people saying Cloud 2.0 or Cloud 3.0. You hear it with networking, storage, whatnot. But cloud really has held its own of it is just an always on, always available, and always up to date.
So, Mark, what's your FAQ this week?
So mine has revolved around people wanting to know what other people are doing, and certainly, sort of from a business-to-business type question. But they're asking me, what are other companies doing with their intranet in the cloud? So they know that I focus on a lot of what SharePoint and our integrated offerings around the intranet. So standing up your company portal, standing up divisional type portals, using things for that broad reach. And they just want to know, certainly like any other customer, has somebody else done it? Have they done it before me? Or just what are they doing? I'd like to learn from it. So the answer I actually put together just a couple of weeks ago, and it's out there, and we'll put the link in the show notes, was actually a sway that answered that. I have at the very top, it says, have you ever asked what other companies do with their SharePoint-based intranet in Office 365? And when you go to that, it is a simple sway, as you can imagine, and really from top to bottom, there are 12 case studies, each with quotes from individuals from those companies that are talking about what they do with their intranet. So there is a quote from the company Cummins, where they really wanted to build out a digital workplace, and they've got a really interesting business model for how they wanted to enable their employees, all the way through to a show that's near and dear to my heart, which is the Funko team, and how they really stood up the intranet from a very old version of SharePoint, 2007, and really dove right into taking advantage of the cloud, all the way through to what we actually do with our cloud. So there's even one case study that recently was put out there in a white paper format around what Microsoft did to get to the cloud and how we're actually standing up, taking advantage of things like communication sites, hub sites, but really the thinking around of how you got there.
It's interesting. I think it's very much part of human nature that our customers sometimes, when they're first to do something, they really do want to know that they're also pioneers. At the same time, other customers want to make sure they're not the first to do something, that they're following a well-established pattern so they know they'll be successful. And there's a broad range of solutions, just as there are a nearly infinite number of clouds out there.
And that's very true. I actually think part of the value of the data center, truly, like I think we've heard in this episode, is the data center itself. Once you walk into one of these places and understand what goes into it, obviously what comes out of it, and the value that just the data center itself brings, that's a massive, massive investment. And I think it's something that Microsoft has invested in for years and has long-term R&D and investments in it. And I couldn't even imagine as a customer today thinking, boy, my business is not running data centers. It's not to manage servers. And we know that that's some of the core value. Certainly when people think of the cloud, what is the value? But when they look at the time that they can actually spend and the money that they can save by not investing in the data center themselves behind the firewall, and then really taking it into the business value. What can we build? How can we offer new offerings? As simple as how can we have a new Power App for the something that we want to do next week, or all the way up to let's plan a nice healthy company portal for this next month or two and then make it real, or the life cycle of something.
What was really fascinating to me this week was in going through Redmond Ridge, taking a look at the hyperscale that we even see in our test environments, let alone our production environments. I remember back in the day setting up my own data centers with 100, 200, 1,000 servers. And I realized as good as those data centers were, I hope, it is completely irrelevant to the way that a massive extended cloud fabric runs.
So to wrap up my FAQ, I wanted to end on a quote that's in this way from Kurt Dykes. He's the vice president of IT at Funko. And he says, SharePoint is our tent pole around which everything else is either funneled through or funneled from. And I think that's a really nice quote, obviously, to get their sentiment, but it's also the essence of the data center. They put a lot of trust and information, and of course all their people are working through our data centers, and so we value their business, and also at the same time, that's their feedback from how the data centers really support them. They think of it certainly as SharePoint running the data center. We think of it as the value that we pass along to our customers.
Awesome. And now we turn to upcoming events in the world of SharePoint. Obviously, next week, September 24th to 28th, we'll be in Orlando, Florida, and we really encourage you to stay tuned for next week's episode. We'll be live from the expo floor with Jeff Teeper, Vice President over SharePoint, OneDrive, Office, and lots of other things.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions we want to ask Jeff. Not only how did it go today, but a lot of his thinking and a brain dump right into that episode. Also, look for any SharePoint events at SPS Events, which is the SharePoint Saturdays. This weekend, there's an event in Casablanca and Lima. And early in October, there are events in Denver, Istanbul, and Milan. Yes, I would like to go to that last one. And of course, New England, October 20th, which is why we think Chris might be in New England.
I will be keynoting there. So
Ooh,
if you're
very nice.
If you're out for apple picking, pumpkin picking, Tom Brady watching, please swing by the MTC in New England on October 20th.
So if you've ever asked yourself, has Tom Brady ever thrown a football the distance of a data center? Chris will have that answer for you live in New England, October 20th.
You know, having seen some of the plans of some of our data centers, I'm not sure he could.
Yeah, we might have to get somebody like Ray Guy from the past to kick it, to Tom Brady to throw it, to then Tony Dorsett to run it into the very end zone.
Ray Guy, I like where you're going with
Yeah, huh? I'm pulling back from where my brain is in the way back zone.
And Tony Dorsett takes the ball, touchdown, and spikes it in the intrazone.
Thank you to our guests, Som Coelho, Zach Rosenfield, and Richard Harrison.
We encourage you to check out our show page for links to all of what was discussed today and more. Go to aka.ms/theintrazone.
And we love hearing from listeners. Do send us your questions and feedback for the SharePoint team or for Chris and I. You can reach us via email at theintrazone@microsoft.com or via Twitter @SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000.
Remember to rate, review, and tell all of your friends and family about the show. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you so much for listening. We're your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty. This has been The Intrazone, a show about the SharePoint Intelligent Intranet, running in the cloud.